Resume. So this session is being recorded, and we ask that you please stay muted during the presentation. And if you need to move around or you're driving by any chance, please make sure your video is off as well. And we're going to hold questions till the end of the presentation. And feel free to put your questions in the chat, and then just know that we'll be collecting those and answering them at the end of the presentation. And we will have plenty of time for questions at the end. So just to reiterate, please stay muted. Please turn your camera off if you're moving around or driving, and questions will be answered at the end of the session. So just wanted to start out the meeting letting everybody know what Keene Conservation District is about. This is our mission, and it helps just explain what KCD's focus is, and um, empowering people to conserve and enhance our natural resources, which are soil, water, food systems, forests, habitat, now and for future generations. And we envision a community where everyone has access to these resources and guidance they need to be conservation stewards. And we engage with land managers to move them from awareness to action with outreach and education. Okay. So I'll get started talking about the purpose of the grant program. And just for those of you that just came in, we just want to remind you that we'll take questions at the end of the presentation, and feel free to put your questions in the chat, and we'll collect those and answer them at the end of this presentation. So you're here to talk about and learn more about the Resilient Communities Bridge Grants, and that is a new grant program that KCD is starting this year. And here's our plan for today, just to talk about all the main things that you need to be aware of if you're going to apply for this grant program. Oops, my mouse is a little bit tricky here. Okay, so the Keene Conservation District Board of Supervisors directed funding to this program in order to reaffirm our commitment to environmental justice, diversity, equity, inclusion, and belonging, in order to acknowledge that communities that have been disproportionately impacted by environmental harms are the least reached with these types of environmental programs. So the focus is to maximize the benefits to King County residents, because that's who we serve, by prioritizing resources where they are needed most, and also to support community resilience by addressing environmental challenges that historically and systemically marginalized communities face. And then finally, this fund is supposed to bridge the funding gap. There's been a lot of funding that has been lost in recent years, and environmental programs that have an emphasis on serving communities has been underfunded, and a lack of funding is going on right now. So this work that we're describing is systemically and currently been underfunded. So the purpose of this program is to fill those gaps. And in terms of the priorities that this program is intended to fund, this priorities are the what, the subject, what are we trying to improve? And they include sustainable agriculture, stormwater and flooding, riparian restoration, forest health, and wildfire resilience. And I will be giving some examples of these types of projects. And there are also examples in the guidelines document. That's one of the resources that we have on our website. These priorities also align with KCD's areas of work. And so along with the priorities, we have a set of actions, which we call natural resource improvement actions. And this is the how. This is how you plan to implement the priorities. And so that can be done by direct on the ground improvement of natural resources, education and outreach, pilot and demonstration projects, and capacity building. And I'll go into a little bit more about what those are. But some examples of projects that combine both of these priorities and actions. A sustainable agriculture example is, say, a BIPOC run community garden or farm implements best management practices to improve soil and health and providing soil health and providing education and demonstration of those best management practices. So it includes the sustainable agriculture components as well as the actions of education and outreach and direct improvements. An example of the stormwater and flooding funding priority would be improving drainage on a farm with multiple BIPOC farmers or a community-led stormwater planning program to capture rainwater or divert stormwater to a rain garden. An example of a riparian restoration project usually involves planting native plants and removal of blackberry and other invasive weeds near a stream or a wetland, which is located near a community center property. And then forest health and wildfire resilience projects can include tree planting and ivy removal in a community park, for example, or wildfire preparedness workshops in a BIPOC community. And so all of these priorities and actions for implementation must be community-led. In terms of who should apply for this and who is eligible, we are hoping that we will get applications from tribes and indigenous-led organizations, as well as community-based organizations and member jurisdictions. So in addition to community-based organizations, we will also fund fiscally sponsored community-based organizations. So if a community group doesn't have nonprofit status, they can link up with a fiscal sponsor who would apply for the grant and manage the grant functions and financial components. Now, you probably are wondering, what are member jurisdictions? So member jurisdictions means cities. There are 35 cities in King County that King Conservation District has funding and services for. And so there's 34 cities, and then there's unincorporated King County is also considered a member jurisdiction. And these are all the cities where our rates and charges funding is collected from. So member jurisdictions have a pot of funding set aside to do natural resource conservation activities along these same lines that I just talked about. And so if you're a city or a county government staffer and you wish to apply to this Resilient Communities Bridge Grant, please contact me and we can talk about it, because you may have other funding available through King Conservation District that could be utilized instead of this funding that's available. So, and then nonprofit organizations do not need to have a letter of authorization from a city to apply to this program. So nonprofits can just directly apply, whereas with our other program, they have to be partnership with a member jurisdiction. So contact me for more clarity on that. I know but we're talking about some different buckets of funding that's available for cities and unincorporated King County governments. Now let's get into frequently asked questions. You may have noticed one of the natural resource improvement actions was capacity building. And so what does that mean? Um, that so all of these projects, when you submit an application, you'll need to address at least one of the natural resource improvement actions and one of the funding priorities. And so the natural resource improvement actions are how you will implement your project. And direct improvement is what it sounds like. It's on the groundwork, repairing, restoration. A lot of projects actually implement more than one natural resource improvement action. So, like education and outreach is a common one and so when you go into your application, you can select more than one natural resource improvement action, but you can only select one natural resource funding priority. That's the sustainable agriculture, forest, and so on. Uh, and then your narrative of your application, you can explain if your project addresses more than one of these funding priorities. So back to what is capacity building. It's basically indirect work that enables conservation activities to occur. So it's capacity building is necessary in order to actually implement improvements of natural resources. So that's why we have that as one of the improvement actions, is it's often necessary to build capacity for an organization, such as funding a staff person who would be able to implement an education and outreach program or things like that. So that's what capacity building is. And so then moving on to the next question, is a demonstrated funding gap required? And the answer to that is no, it is not required in order for you to apply. It's a major priority of this grant program to fill the gaps that were left by funding shortfalls. But it's not required for you to apply to this. And there's opportunities in the grant application to explain the funding situation that you're facing. And also in the budget form, there's an area to put the other funding sources that you may be seeking or you already have for that project you're applying for. So we ask a lot of questions about your funding situation, but if you didn't lose a big grant this year, it doesn't mean you can't apply. So just to clarify on that. Um, so what if your project is in federal way? Well, unfortunately, federal way is not one of our member jurisdictions. It's not in our KCD service area. So the KCD service area, that's where these projects have to occur. And they include most of King County except for 5 cities. And those cities are Federal Way, Enumclaw, Milton, Pacific, and Skycomish. And those cities are not members of our district. So unfortunately, we cannot fund any projects within those city limits. But if a project is in unincorporated King County and maybe it has a Federal Way address, that would be eligible to apply. So let me know if you have questions on that in terms of your project location. All of these projects need to have a public benefit. The funding that this is coming from are public dollars. So projects must have a public benefit, and they cannot benefit just one farm or one property owner. There has to be a larger benefit there in terms of natural resource improvement and community engagement. Um, and so that's the public benefit component of it. Some people ask if they're a nonprofit organization or they're a tribe, do they have to have a fiscal sponsor organization? And in those situations, you do not need to have a fiscal sponsor. A fiscal sponsor is only needed when a community group wants to apply, but they do not have nonprofit 501c3 status. So a fiscal sponsor should be the one submitting the grant application for the community organization. And in that case, the fiscal sponsor would need to attach a fiscal sponsorship agreement. Or if the community group decided that they wanted to apply and they have a fiscal sponsor, but maybe the fiscal sponsor can't fill out the application, the applicant organization will need to upload a letter of fiscal sponsor confirmation. It also could be, instead of the letter, you could upload your fiscal sponsor agreement. And so that is what, the scenarios are for a fiscal sponsor. Can you submit two applications from the same organization? The answer is no. However, if you're a fiscal sponsor organization and you're sponsoring multiple community groups that want to apply, that is the scenario where the same fiscal sponsor organization can apply for multiple grants. And then landowner permission letters are required if the project is occurring on land that is not owned by the organization. It's mostly for on-the-ground projects. It doesn't necessarily have to be like if you have a lease agreement for your office where you do your work. We don't require a landowner permission letter for that scenario. It's more about if a project is occurring on somebody's farm and the landowner is different than the applicant, then that landowner would need to submit a letter of landowner permission for that group to utilize the property. Can you apply for $110,000? That is over the cap. Applications cannot exceed $100,000. And we really discourage anyone from applying for a project that is less than 10,000. So we have those limits on the application amounts. And then in terms of matching funds, this program does not require matching funds, but we do want to know about the other funding sources that you have. And so there's a place for that in the budget, your budget form, to list other funding sources, but match is not required. It's important to know that these grants are reimbursement based. So there is an option for grantees to receive a one-time advance payment, but it has to be approved by the district and the grantee has to demonstrate adequate financial controls. And then after that advance payment, everything goes to reimbursement-based expenses. How early can projects start? They can start as early as September of this year, and ideally starting no later than the end of the first quarter of 2027. And projects usually can be up to 2 years in duration. They can be less than that. And if we are pretty lenient about extending completion dates if that's necessary. So, but we generally recommend proposing a 2-year grant, and the funding is a one-time grant for the duration of the project. It's not 75,000 for year one and 75,000 for year two. It's just 75,000 for 2 years of a project, if that makes sense. So, what if you have a currently open KCD grant contract? You can apply for this Resilient Communities grant as long as it's not for the exact same project that your grant is currently open, and the timeline does not overlap with the current grant. So, however, if you're wanting to apply for the next phase of your project that you currently have an open contract for, you can, as long as the timelines do not overlap with your current project, so then you can apply. So, say for example, the phase one is you currently have a grant for your phase one of your project at KCD, and it goes from January 2026 to December 2026. And you want to apply for this program for phase two of your project. That project will need to start January of 2027, and it can't overlap. And there needs to be a clear indication that your grant will be closing. We won't award a new grant until your currently open one. We won't get started on a new grant until your currently open grant is closed. Okay, so now we're going to jump in to the required forms that are needed for your application. And so the online application is required. We cannot accept a paper copy unless you need accommodations. And you can let me know if you need some kind of accommodations for something alternative to the online application. And then I'm going to show you the budget table and the work plan that's required. And we're going to go look at the application in the online grant portal. So when you log into our grant portal, this is what you should see. And if you don't see these opportunities, make sure to click on the apply button here, and these will pop up. The one that you want to apply for that we're talking about today is this Resilient Communities Bridge Grant. And take note that the due date for applications is June 17th at 5 p.m. And so there will not be any exceptions to that deadline. So you'll want to click on the apply button. And then I'm going to show you what it looks like in the grant portal. Stop sharing for a second. Okay, so as I showed you, this is the apply page. This is what you want to click on to look at the application. And it'll open up this form. And if you need to leave the grant portal and you need to get back to your application, it will only save if you start typing stuff in. If you don't type anything, it won't save a copy to your profile, but you can get back to your application by going to this house icon. And once you start working on it, your application will be saved and you can find it again there. This is the application form. You will be able to access the required forms and the letter templates in the application, as well as the guidelines. And we strongly encourage you to read the guidelines before you apply for a grant. And so the first part of the application is a lot of information gathering about the type of organization you are, the fiscal sponsorship scenarios, and then there's a short project description, start and end dates, project location, and then we ask you to uh, mark which King County Council District your project is associated with, because KCD reports to King County on where we've funded all the work we've funded throughout the county and by council district. So we can go to the council members and say, hey, this is what we funded in your district. And so that's why we need that information. Here's areas where you can upload landowner permission. And this is the section on the priorities and actions that I talked about. And so here you can see that it's you can only select one of the priorities, but you can talk about your narrative about how your project might accomplish more than one thing, like riparian restoration and forest health would be a scenario where you could describe that. And then these actions, you can click on all of them or two of them. But you have to click on one of them. So anywhere where there's this little asterisk next to the question, that is a required question. So um, you'll see this message if you have left something unfilled out. So this is where it gets into the narrative of your project, and then we have character count limits. So you can see this here, and we have a suggestion about how long your responses can be. So, and you don't have to respond to fill the entire character limit amount. You don't have to fill it. It's just there as a guideline so that we don't get too many really long applications. So we're trying to minimize the amount of work that you have to do for these applications. But these questions are listed in the grant guidelines. And we also have a worksheet of the application that you can download. It's a Word document from our webpage, and you can fill out the narrative components in the Word document and then copy and paste your answers into the online application. So that is the online application. And then I'll go back to my PowerPoint and show you the forms. So here's the budget table. You'll notice that these categories on the left are locked. These are the standard accounting expense categories that we fund. And then there is space down here to add some other expense categories that you might need to add to your budget. But generally, try to lump your expenses into these categories. And if you need help with that, let us know. Then you'll enter the amounts here that make up your budget and your KCD request. And then in this other section, you'll add other funding sources that you have. So you can write a note here, say this is cooperative management funds, 50,000, and you could write a note here that you're currently applying for this and you don't know if you're going to get it or something like that. And then you can, down here in the notes section at the bottom, you can add more detail about whatever you have in your budget here. So like if you have 50,000 in contracted and professional services, then you might want to add down here, which will help the review of your grant. what those contracted services are. Maybe they're an educator or a crew or speakers or something like that. The more detail that you can put in here that helps the grant reviewers understand your budget, the more likely, your application will be successful. And so the totals that you enter into these columns will populate down here, and you can't change these amounts. They have to be changed in the body of the table, and it'll add up your total funding request, your other funding sources, and your total, and then that will add up to your total project cost. The work plan table is where we find all the detail on what it is you're going to be doing and what are your expected outcomes and outputs. We have an explanation of what activities might be and outputs and outcomes. And we also want to know the estimated timeline for these activities. And I forgot to mention with the budget, indirect costs. So KCD covers up to 25% of salaries and benefits in indirect costs. And if you don't have salaries and benefits in your budget, you can put indirect costs in your budget up to 25% of direct project costs. So our total direct costs. So we do fund indirect, and the limit is 25% of either salaries and benefits or direct project costs. And yeah, please review our guidelines for more detail on expenses that are eligible and some of the policies. So this work plan table is very valuable in terms of review of the grant application to really understand what are you actually going to be doing with the funds and what are the expected outcomes. Okay, and so I mentioned the application question worksheet, and you can work on that offline and then copy and paste. And then the letter templates that we have are available on the website and in the grant application, and they include the fiscal sponsor confirmation letter and a landowner permission letter. And so those are required depending on your type of project. So you may not need these if your project doesn't include those elements. And then we have a partnership commitment letter that we have. This is something we've started to do so that all the groups that are involved in these grant application projects are aware and committed, because sometimes people will say, oh, I'm working with this group, and the other group doesn't know anything about it. So this is necessary, and it demonstrates your awareness or the awareness of the project partner and their involvement and commitment. And the partnership commitment letter should talk about the partner's role in the project. So this is optional, but it's highly encouraged. And then in terms of successful applications, this is the criteria that we are scoring each of these applications with. The applications are due on June 17th at 5 p.m. The review of the applications will take place in July, and then everyone that applies will be notified by August 7th of the decisions for funding. So as you can read here and in the grant guidelines, these are the things that we will be looking for. Strong alignment with equity and the conservation goals, relevancy to the communities impacted, community-led projects, and how feasible is this project? And are tribes or indigenous-led organizations involved? This is not required as part of your project, but we are prioritizing tribe and indigenous-led projects. And then also we'll look at what's the funding gap, what's the need. Um, so those are the criteria that we will be looking at for all of these applications. We have a lot of resources on our webpage, and I'm going to give you the link to that page in a little bit. But as you're here today, you're here for our information session. This will be recorded and posted on our website. So for people that missed it or couldn't stay for the whole time, they can watch that. We have the guidelines, which are the number one resource that we really encourage people to review. And then we're offering office hours. So there's a place to sign up on our website for a 30-minute session with KCD staff to ask about your project ideas and if they are in alignment with the funding criteria. We'll also have an opportunity for people that go to those office hours to reach out to for additional technical assistance beyond what KCD staff can do. And that would be helping with the grant application, reviewing it, and suggesting areas where more emphasis can be applied and things like that. So a little more hands-on technical assistance and then KCD staff can provide. So if you sign up for office hours, then you'll be connected with that technical assistant if you want to get more help. And if you want to sign up for office hours, but the times available don't work for you, you can email me and we can try to schedule something outside of those office hours. And I mentioned the application question worksheet. So those are the resources we have for you on our website. This concludes the presentation, and now we'll go into questions. I also wanted to put the QR code for our webpage up for you so you could take a snap of this QR code and get right to the webpage that I'm talking about. And I'll leave that up for just a second and then we'll go to questions. If there are any. I haven't been able to look at the chat. Okay. Do we have questions? Okay. Re-granting funds. No, that is not allowed as part of this funding opportunity. Earlier. So the question was for the video recording, can projects re-grant funds? And the answer to that is no. These are direct grants to organizations. And then another question is, you said that projects must be community-led. Can you say a little bit about what community-led means? Yeah, so we want these projects to be led by communities that are most impacted by environmental harms. And so that means that the community is deeply engaged in the project. It's not one of those things where an organization comes in and does a project and leaves. It's a project where the community has decided they wanted to do this and they are taking steps to implement the project. So it's about the deep partnerships and really authentic, deep partnerships with community groups. The question was, could stormwater and flooding projects be at multiple sites under the same grant application? Yes, there. And if you have multiple sites, you can write in there under your project location in the application that there's multiple sites. And you can try to enter multiple addresses, and then the character limit might cut you off, but um, you can explain that. And in the landowner permission letters, that's another place where you could explain that there's multiple projects involved or multiple sites. Um, Tuition support within our educational program. Since tuition is not broken out separately in our budget, should we use other as the category in the budgeting table and explain it in the notes? Yes, I think that would probably be good since that's kind of a different one. Um, we also have people put stipends in the budget as a other category as well. So, yeah, that would work. But I don't know if tuition is eligible for it. I'd have to learn a little bit more about your project. Um, is there a limit or recommended percent of funding for project related staffing and salaries? No, there is no limit and there's no recommendations. Um, and can you give an example of indirect costs? Yes, that's a good question. We consider indirect costs like admin or overall organizational payroll or accounting services that aren't directly related to the project. So anything that isn't directly related, like rent possibly, or a portion of like a office copier or something like that. There's that might not be the greatest example, but it's basically anything that you can't say is directly for the project. So a lot of things are really direct costs, but we have some like administrative functions that are like maybe your grant wants to pay for a portion of the time to put together a payroll report or things like that. So those are some of the examples. Um, so yeah, I hope that helps. Could event planning be covered? Yes, that can be covered. We require for events, we require sign-in sheets and description of the events and how they relate to the project, to the grant. So, and then the rules of the people in attendance. And if there's food involved, which is eligible, we need detailed receipts of the food purchase. And so we require a lot of documentation for events, but they are covered. Can applicants apply for both this grant and the upcoming 2026 member jurisdiction grant if projects are different? Yes. And the member jurisdiction grant is currently open right now at the same time as the Resilient Communities grant. But I will want to talk with you about the plan for that. If they're two distinct projects, that makes total sense. But if they are the same project, we might need to have a conversation about that. Can you repeat again the timeline of when the project can start and end? Yes, so projects can start as early as this year in the fall, like as soon as if you were to get the award and you find out in August, you could start in September. It doesn't have to start in September. It could start in January. And ideally, we don't want projects to start too late into 2027 because, we want this funding to work for projects that are ready to go and need that funding. So by the end of the first quarter of 2027, we're hope that, projects would be getting started by that date at least. And then they can last for 2 years with options for extending. So, but yeah, typically we don't see applications. We don't want to see applications for more than 2 years. My organization currently has a KCD grant and is interested in applying as a phase 2 to our current project. Our current timeline has our project wrapping in 2020, January 27, and reporting due in March. We would have to fix those overlapping timelines. And like I said, we would want to close out the first grant before getting started and funding the second grant. So I recommend that with projects that are in process right now and that they focus on the current grant you have and then or finishing it up before you start the next one. So yeah, hopefully that helps a little bit. Would hydrological monitoring to support a community-led wetland rehydration project be eligible for funding? Interesting. As long as it fits within the criteria for, communities most impacted by environmental harms and the natural resource activities, it could be eligible for funding. So yeah, I haven't heard of wetland rehydration. That's interesting. So yeah, please do sign up for office hours if you need, want to talk about it a little bit more. But yeah, great questions. Um, can a project start in 2027 and continue 2 years? Yes. No, school district properties would be eligible for projects. They're public, like there's some restriction on accessing them, but they're generally public properties. Um, so, but you would definitely need permission from the school to do the work that you're describing in written form. But yes, school projects are definitely eligible. Great questions, everybody. If there isn't any more, we'll go ahead and conclude here. But thank you so much and have a great rest of your day.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.